miles of Atlantic water, where daylight is only a pale memory and pressure shapes metal into slow collapses, the wreck of the RMS Titanic rests in a landscape of sediment and shadow. For more than a century, the ship has been an archive of objects, suitcases, crockery, invitations, and the occasional child's toy that surfaces in photographs to remind us that history is small and human. In a recent season, an expedition to the lower decks recorded a discovery that reframed how its modern custodians understood personal things left behind in disaster. The operation was planned as a methodical documentation project. The team included maritime archaeologists, conservation specialists, a tight-knit ROV crew, and a small film unit tasked with producing a documentary segment that would place the material culture of the Titanic into public perspective. Protocols were rehearsed, ethical guidelines reviewed, and contingency plans drafted to prevent both accidental disturbance and the sensationalizing of a site many believe must be treated as a grave. The atmosphere on deck was professional and solemn. The priorities were respect, accuracy, and the preservation of context. Early in the dive, the feed from the ROV presented the familiar: collapsed stairwells, curtains of rust, a scatter of household detritus lit by circular beams that cut through blackness like careful flashlights. Then the camera turned into a recessed alcove and stopped. In the pool of artificial light, 3 dolls were visible, one seated upright, propped against a corroded form that might once have been a radiator. Another reclined beneath folds of textile, half swallowed by silt. A third hung from a bent buckle, paint flaked where time had taken what was once glossy. The image was both ordinary and odd. Ordinary because dolls are common. Odd because this composition suggested something beyond mere chance. What unsettled the team was not merely the dolls' survival, but the suggestion of human arrangement. In a wreck, torn by violent fragmentation and battered by decades of currents, and microbial decay, accidental alignments are possible. Yet this vignette had the geometry of intention. Threads looped in a tidy knot, a scarf tucked like a lap blanket, a strip of leather doubled to cradle one doll. For the archaeologists, these were data points that demanded recording. For others on the deck, they felt almost like a miniature shrine left in shadow. The first reactions were practical. The ROV pilots adjusted cameras to acquire stereoscopic imagery for photogrammetry. The conservation lead annotated the feed with notes about pigments and textile weave. The film director called for calm. But within hours, the mood among the crew had shifted towards something quieter and more questioning. Conversations that had been brisk and technical grew tentative. One pilot later described a sensation of entering a place where proximity amplified memory. It felt like walking into a room where the air holds a story, he said, and the description stuck among the team. An immediate debate unfolded about procedure. Should the dolls be recovered? The conservationist argued that salt, microorganisms, and the mechanical action of currents would eventually reduce paints and fibers to powders. Retrieval to a controlled laboratory would allow stabilization and prevent loss. The archaeologists cautioned that removal severs context. In situ, an object's position relative to others is a line of evidence. Lift it out of its matrix and valuable information can vanish. The film crew wanted to capture the image for viewers who could not visit the wreck, while ethicists urged restraint, reminding everyone that the site was also a resting place for hundreds of lives. After deliberation, the team adopted a measured approach. Rather than immediate retrieval, they expanded the survey. High-resolution 3D mapping, sediment sampling, pigment analysis via remote spectroscopy, and exhaustive photographic documentation. An autonomous sampler collected micro-environmental data to inform simulations of degradation. The chosen path was conservative, privileging long-term stewardship over headline-grabbing recovery. Even so, the decision did not silence speculation. Once word of the discovery reached public channels, commentary and conjecture multiplied. Technical analysis complicated the narrative further. Microscopic imaging suggested that the dolls were composite in manufacture. One had a bisque face affixed to a cloth body. Another featured a head of a harder material that bore traces of later repair. Pigment analysis revealed layers that suggested repainting, and fibers in a scarf matched yarns common in mass-produced textiles of the era. The conservators posited that the dolls had been mended and dressed over time, possibly indicating prolonged attachment and care. The implication that someone had tended these toys posed questions about where domestic life ended and where the exigencies of disaster began. As the documentary segment aired, public reaction resembled a chorus of competing impulses. For some, the vignette was proof of haunting. Viewers projected ghostly narratives onto cracked porcelain faces. Others took a genealogical tack, sending photos and family lore to the research institute in hopes of identifying possible owners. An unexpected correspondence arrived from a great-grandchild of a third-class passenger who supplied a faded photograph showing a child clutching a simple rag doll. The resemblance was not conclusive, but such notes transformed sterile debate into human longing, a private hope that a lost thing might reconnect a family to a fragment of its past. The team found itself negotiating not only conservation science, but public sentiment. They reorganized outreach to emphasize context and restraint. The documentary's director added interviews with material culture experts and ethicists who discussed the limits of narrative certainty. Press materials underscored that the dolls remained in situ, pending any formal decision guided by conservation criteria and descendant consultation. The Institute convened a panel to consider the dolls within a framework that balanced scientific inquiry, public interest, and moral obligation. That panel produced a recommendation grounded in precaution. Continue non-intrusive documentation, establish a schedule of periodic reassessments, and contact descendant communities through archival networks before any recovery. The recommendation reflected a larger debate in maritime archaeology, a tension between rescuing fragile artifacts and preserving context, between the public's hunger for tangible connections to the past and the scientific imperative to protect sites from commodification. The language chosen was careful. "We will not act without evidence and without consultation," the report stated, and the wording signaled an institutional willingness to defer gratification to duty. Over subsequent seasons, the doll's alcove evolved subtly. Storm-driven currents shifted sediment in thin waves. Microbial mats spread like whispering lace across rivets and cloth fringes. The ROV returned periodically, as if checking on a bedside patient, and each visit added small details to the record. A loose thread here, a pigment flake there, traces of an old adhesion that hinted at prior handling. The site resisted quick answers. Each piece of data multiplied questions about ownership, meaning, and the chain of custody for things left behind in catastrophe. Institutes and universities used the episode as a catalyzing case study, drafting frameworks to guide similar discoveries. Protocols for descendant outreach, standards for non-invasive imaging, and criteria for prioritizing artifacts at immediate risk. Conservation labs prepared simulation programs to model degradation under varying scenarios, while ethicists worked with archivists to draft language that would avoid sensationalism in public releases. Educational programs translated the technical findings into curricula that taught both maritime history and the ethics of archaeological stewardship, and public forums invited descendants and communities to participate in deliberations and to emphasize the humanity in each object found, and to honor lives behind each fragile artifact. The most enduring lesson from the episode was less about dolls and more about how modern observers choose to engage with the past. The team's restraint, its insistence on documentation, consultation, and conservation research, became a model for respectful exploration. The dolls remained where currents and microbes could reach them, but they were no longer mere curiosities. They entered into a catalogue, a sequence of measured observations that could be revisited in the light of new techniques or new information. The act of not immediately recovering them was itself a decision with moral weight. In the end, the scene at the lower deck remained an unresolved miniature. 3 dolls arranged in shadow, witnesses to a human catastrophe that resists neat narratives. The divers and researchers who encountered them returned, changed in small, persistent ways. They carried with them a renewed sense of responsibility. to treat artifacts not as trophies, but as traces that connect us to the lives that produced them and the public, given a glimpse of the dolls through film and careful reporting, confronted a larger question about how to remember, whether to seek instant ownership of relics or to cultivate patience and respect for the fragments